The sound of Lindsey Graham's voice tore through the chamber like a thunderclap, sharp and abrasive, rattling against the marble walls. He was on his feet, leaning forward, his words spat rather than spoken, his fingers stabbing the air as though volume could substitute for truth. Reporters jolted their pens across notepads, camera shutters snapped like gunfire, and aides shifted uneasily in their seats. It wasn't just an argument. It was a spectacle. The Senate floor had seen its share of heated debates, but this was something different. Graham's tone wasn't reasoned dissent. It was rage barely kept in check, a fury that made the chamber itself feel smaller, darker. His face flushed crimson, his voice cracking under its own force. He seemed less a statesman and more a man cornered. Clawing for dominance, he felt slipping away. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even shift in her seat. Her stillness became its own kind of power, drawing attention precisely because it contrasted so completely with the storm raging a few feet away. While Graham's arms sliced the air, she kept her hands folded neatly, eyes steady, her very posture, saying what words could not. Composure is the greatest form of defiance. The room felt suspended between these two figures, one unraveling, the other unyielding. Spectators in the gallery leaned forward, transfixed. A few senators averted their eyes, uncomfortable with the rawness of it all. Yet the reporters, sensing history in the making, kept their gaze locked, desperate not to miss the moment when this clash tipped from theater into legend. Graham's voice cracked again, the strain of anger fraying his words. He demanded, accused, belittled, yet every insult he hurled seemed to vanish into the silence surrounding Crockett, as though swallowed whole by her calm. That silence began to feel louder than his shouting, and in it, the balance of the room shifted. His fury no longer filled the chamber. Her restraint did, and as the echoes of his last shout died against the walls, Crockett finally leaned toward the microphone. The chamber stilled. Every eye turned toward her, waiting. But no one in that chamber, not even Graham himself, was prepared for the calm line that would leave him speechless. To understand why this clash carried so much weight, you have to step back from the shouting match and look at the setting itself. This wasn't just another routine committee meeting, the kind that drifts into C-SPAN obscurity. It was a hearing centered on judicial fairness, the very question of whether America's courts still lived up to their promise of blind justice. At stake were not only legal precedents but the deeper soul of democracy. Who gets to be heard, who gets to decide, and whose dignity counts when the gavel falls. The room carried that gravity. Behind the formal titles and polished wood desks, every senator knew the subtext. America's divisions were on trial just as much as any nominee. For Graham, it was an opportunity to flex power, to remind the cameras that his voice could dominate the chamber. For Crockett, it was something far more profound. She wasn't just sitting there as a participant. She was there as a symbol of the millions of voices too often drowned out in halls of power, the working-class families, immigrants, and young Americans who wanted the system to finally see them. That's what made Graham's eruption so charged. He wasn't simply arguing a point of law. He was performing the same act that has echoed across centuries, shouting down those who dared to speak differently, dismissing the legitimacy of someone who embodied a changing America. His words might have been aimed at a legal technicality, but the fire behind them was personal, almost primal. The anger of a man who felt his grip on the narrative slipping. Crockett's silence, her refusal to take the bait, reshaped the moment. Viewers at home would later say it was like watching two different worlds collide, one steeped in arrogance and entitlement, the other anchored in restraint and self-respect. The stakes weren't just about who won the exchange in the chamber. The stakes were about whose story America would believe, because beyond those walls the nation was watching. Cameras rolled. Clips were already being marked for replay. Social media staffers for news outlets were slicing the footage into bite-sized moments designed to travel. And though Graham thundered as if volume could make him the headline, history often remembers the response, not the outburst. What happened here would not stay locked in marble corridors. Within hours, millions would see it on their phones. Within days, it would flood timelines, trending hashtags framing Crockett as the embodiment of calm strength. The line she had not yet spoken would ricochet across feeds, stitched into reaction videos, echoed by late-night hosts, and carved into the memory of anyone who ever needed proof that composure could dismantle fury. But in that moment, inside the chamber, none of that had happened yet. The air still trembled with Graham's last shout, his hands still twitching with restless energy, his face still flushed. The nation's larger struggle, between a politics of dignity and a politics of destruction that was playing out in real time. The clash wasn't finished. In fact, the sharpest barbs, the most cutting words had not even been spoken. The chamber leaned forward, the tension thick enough to be felt in every corner. The insults were about to escalate beyond anything anyone expected. Lindsey Graham did not arrive at this moment by accident. His entire career has been a study in contradictions. A man who has made a living by navigating the tides of power while pretending he was swept along against his will. For decades, he has presented himself as the Southern gentleman lawyer, the steady conservative voice, the man who could scold his opponents in one breath and flash a smile in the next. Yet beneath that carefully rehearsed performance lies something else, a restless appetite for the spotlight, and a history of shouting his way into relevance when reason failed to hold the crowd. He has played every role the political stage could offer: the defender of tradition, the reformer, the critic of his own party when it suited him, the loyalist when it suited him more. He scolded presidents before bowing to them. He condemned extremism before excusing it. His speeches are filled with reversals, and his record reads like a man rewriting his own story mid-sentence. For those who know him, that inconsistency is not a quirk. It's a survival strategy. But with Graham, the contradictions are never hidden quietly. They erupt in public, often in moments of frustration. Watch enough hearings and a pattern emerges. When pressed, when cornered, when asked to defend the indefensible, his voice rises. His tone sharpens. His words come faster, louder, almost desperate. What should be reasoned debate turns into theater, the kind where veins bulge and tempers flare. He is not unaware of this tendency. In fact, he leans on it, knowing that anger creates headlines and headlines preserve relevance. This is why his reputation has always walked the line between statesman and showman. To his allies, the theatrics make him seem forceful, willing to fight. To his critics, they reveal the hollowness beneath the bluster, the insecurity of a man who knows that fury is easier to summon than evidence. More than once, his red-faced tirades have overshadowed the very arguments he was trying to make. And still, he repeats the cycle, as though addicted to the adrenaline rush of the performance. The irony is impossible to miss. Graham projects strength, but it is often when he feels weakest that his anger burns hottest. His outbursts arrive not when he is on solid ground, but when the foundation beneath him begins to crack. Shouting for him is not just a weapon, it is a shield, a way to cover the wobble in his reasoning, the inconsistencies in his record, the deep awareness that he cannot always justify his shifting positions. Colleagues have whispered this for years. Some roll their eyes when he launches into another monologue, knowing it is more for the cameras than the chamber. Others smile thinly, recognizing that the louder Graham becomes, the less convincing his case truly is. And the public too has noticed. Clips of his fiery outbursts circulate not because they persuade, but because they entertain, the political equivalent of watching a storm break without warning. That is the persona Lindsey Graham carried into this hearing. Not just a senator defending his point of view, but a performer stepping into a familiar role. He believed volume would once again carry the day, that his booming voice and practiced indignation could dominate the narrative, could bend the chamber to his energy. He had done it before, and in the echo chamber of Washington, past successes often feel like guarantees of future ones. But there is a danger in leaning too heavily on theatrics. Sooner or later, performance meets resistance. Sooner or later, an audience stops being dazzled and starts demanding substance, And sooner or later a voice raised too often begins to sound hollow, no matter how loudly it echoes. That day, Graham's theatrics met their reckoning. His contradictions, his reliance on temper, his addiction to spectacle, they were all on display, magnified by the cameras, amplified by his own choices. He was not a man in control of the moment. He was a man thrashing against it, unaware that his familiar strategy was about to collapse in front of him, because on this day Graham's signature temper would collide with a force he couldn't shout down. Long before Jasmine Crockett's name echoed through the marble chambers of Congress, it was spoken in classrooms, courtrooms, and neighborhoods where few believed a young black woman from Texas would one day rise to the national stage. Her story does not begin with privilege or easy access, but with grit, the kind born of long hours, tireless study, and a determination to turn her sharp mind into a tool for justice. Crockett grew up knowing the world did not hand out fairness equally. She saw how doors opened smoothly for some but stayed bolted shut for others. Rather than let those barriers dictate her path, she turned each one into a challenge. Books became her allies. Debate sharpened her instincts. She realized early on that knowledge wasn't just power, it was protection, a shield against those who underestimated her because of her background, her gender, or the color of her skin. When she chose the law, it wasn't simply a career decision, it was a calling. She became an attorney not to bask in prestige but to give voice to those who had none. In cramped offices and crowded courthouses, she represented people who couldn't afford expensive lawyers, people who felt swallowed by a system designed to overlook them. Her clients weren't the wealthy and powerful. They were the working poor, the marginalized, the forgotten. Each case was more than paperwork. It was a life that deserved dignity. The courtroom taught her a rhythm that would shape her entire public presence. Opposing attorneys might thunder and pound their fists, but Crockett learned the true art of persuasion was not in volume, but in precision. The calmer she was, the more control she commanded. The quieter her tone, the more every word carried. She was a student of composure, training herself to remain steady even when provoked, to let silence hang in the air until the weight of truth pressed harder than any insult could. That discipline carried her into public office. When she stepped into politics, she did not abandon her roots as an advocate. Instead, she expanded the battlefield. On the campaign trail, she spoke not in platitudes but in plain language, the kind that connected to voters who rarely saw themselves reflected in power. She campaigned with the conviction that representation mattered, that a Congress which claimed to speak for America must actually look like America. Her opponents sneered. Some dismissed her as too inexperienced, others as too brash, and still others resorted to the oldest, ugliest critiques reserved for women of color in politics, that she was angry, loud, or unpolished. What they missed entirely was the quiet strength beneath the surface. They mistook clarity for bluntness, confidence for arrogance, and in doing so, they revealed more about their own insecurities than about her character. Crockett never needed to match insult with insult. Her power lay in refusing to play by those rules. She chose instead to embody dignity, the kind that cannot be rattled by cheap attacks, the kind that transforms a chamber when she enters it. When others shout, she listens. When others bluster, she measures her words. And when others lean on theatrics, she leans on truth. For her supporters, she became more than a representative. She became proof. Proof that intelligence and persistence can break barriers. Proof that a woman of color could rise to the highest halls of government without abandoning her authenticity. Proof that the future of American politics does not belong to those who cling to rage, but to those who can transform it into resolve. Her lawyerly composure became her defining trait. Even in heated debates, she never seemed rushed. Even under hostile questioning, her eyes stayed steady, her voice measured, her presence unshakable. Observers often remarked that she looked more like a teacher correcting a student than a politician, defending herself, and that calmness was not an act. It was the product of years in courtrooms where staying collected was the difference between justice delivered and justice denied. That is the woman who sat across from Lindsey Graham on that day. While his voice rose, hers did not. While his Gestures cut the air. Her hands rested still. She had learned long ago that storms burn themselves out, but steady ground endures. In Crockett, supporters see a leader unafraid to confront arrogance, yet unwilling to mirror it. They see someone who embodies grace not as softness but as strength, the strength to remain whole when others try to tear you down. Her critics may try to caricature her, but they cannot erase the fact that her rise is rooted in resilience. And those very qualities, once mocked by her opponents, would soon prove to be her sharpest weapon. The chamber was a tinderbox, and Graham was the spark. His voice thundered across the room, each sentence sharper than the last, his words less about policy now and more about power. He cut across colleagues mid-sentence, jabbed the air with a pointed finger and pushed his chair back with a screech so that every movement felt like punctuation to his fury. Each interruption was louder, each accusation more personal, and the chamber seemed to tremble with the weight of his determination to dominate. Reporters scribbled furiously, pens scratching the page as though racing to keep up with his rage. Cameras zoomed in, catching every flinch of his jaw, every flash of anger that darted across his reddened face. He wasn't asking questions anymore. He was demanding submission, as if the chamber itself should bend to his anger. And yet, across from him, Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still. She did not fidget. She did not roll her eyes. She did not match his rising volume with her own. Her stillness became louder than his shouting, a counterweight so striking that it pulled the attention of the entire room. Every time he lunged forward, she stayed rooted. Every time he flung an insult, she let the silence stretch, allowing his words to echo back at him, stripped of their intended sting. The contrast was cinematic. Graham looked like a man fighting against a storm of his own making, while Crockett looked like a lighthouse steady against the crashing waves. Senators shifted in their seats, some trying to hide their discomfort, others clearly enjoying the spectacle. The gallery leaned forward, breathless, as if they too sensed the chamber was seconds away from collapse into pure chaos. The escalation was relentless. Graham's voice broke with strain as he interrupted yet again, refusing to let Crockett finish a point. He waved his hands as if swatting away her presence entirely, desperate to reassert control. His volume swelled, filling every corner of the chamber, but with each decibel gained, his composure slipped further away. Crockett, however, never wavered. Her eyes tracked him calmly, her posture upright, her expression unreadable. To the cameras, it looked like a duel between two philosophies of power, one relying on noise, the other on poise. And in that duel, the silence became unbearable. The room seemed to know instinctively that something had to break. Either Graham would push the chamber into outright chaos, or Crockett would find a way to cut through his storm. Every insult felt like a hammer blow, but the strange alchemy of the moment turned them into boomerangs, swinging back toward Graham himself. His anger no longer looked forceful. It looked frantic. His gestures no longer commanded authority. They revealed desperation. The chamber was watching a performance, yes, but the script was slipping out of his hands. For long seconds, Crockett allowed the noise to roll over her like waves. She did not retreat. She did not respond. She simply endured, letting his fury burn hotter, letting the chamber taste the full contrast between his aggression and her composure. And then, as his voice finally cracked with exhaustion, as his argument crumbled beneath its own weight, the silence became total. In that silence, Crockett moved. She leaned forward ever so slightly, her hand brushing the microphone. The motion was small, but in the charged air of the chamber, it felt seismic. Every reporter froze. Every senator looked up. Even Graham himself, mid-breath, faltered. And, just when it seemed Graham had cornered her, Crockett leaned into the microphone. The room was suspended in silence, a silence so heavy it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Reporters paused their pens mid-scribble. Senators leaned forward just slightly, their eyes narrowing, waiting. Lindsey Graham had just thrown down the gauntlet, his voice ragged from shouting, his fists clenched as if volume and aggression could still bend the moment to his will. And there, across from him, Jasmine Crockett, leaned into her microphone, her posture still, perfect, her expression calm, her timing deliberate. She did not rush. She did not match his volume. She let the pause hang until the anticipation became unbearable, until even Graham himself seemed caught between impatience and dread. Then, with a voice steady enough to slice through the tension, she spoke. "Senator," she began, her tone quiet but edged with steel. "I was raised to believe that shouting is what you do when you've already lost the argument." The words landed like a hammer wrapped in silk. No theatrics, no flourish, just clarity, delivered with precision. The chamber reacted in a ripple, a sharp inhale from the gallery, a muffled laugh quickly stifled from one corner, eyebrows shooting upward from senators who had grown weary of Graham's tirades. Even the reporters, trained to mask their reactions, exchanged glances as their pens raced to capture the line. Graham blinked. For a split second his mouth opened, but no words came out. The force of her statement had not been in its volume, but in its truth, and that truth hit him squarely, leaving him momentarily stunned. His usual defense, and to charge louder, harder, faster, now felt exposed. Crockett's calmness had framed his shouting not as power but as weakness, a desperate man's crutch. She didn't stop there. Crockett adjusted the microphone slightly, her eyes never leaving Graham's. "I came here to debate ideas," she continued, each word deliberate, "not to drown in noise. If your points can stand on their own, let them. If not, no amount of yelling will make them stronger." The chamber stirred again. Murmurs spread like a current. On one side of the dais, a senator leaned back, almost smiling. On another, a staffer shifted uncomfortably in their chair. The tension in the room had flipped. What had minutes earlier felt like Graham's domain, his volume filling every space, now belonged entirely to Crockett. Graham attempted to recover. He straightened, cleared his throat, and raised a hand as if to interject. But the force behind him was gone. His bluster, once loud enough to dominate, now seemed hollow against her composure. When he tried to speak, his voice cracked, a tremor betraying the confidence he desperately wanted to project. Crockett didn't need to raise her own voice to silence him. Her stillness did the work. She simply turned toward the chair of the hearing, acknowledging protocol, then returned her gaze to Graham, eyes calm, unshaken. That gaze alone seemed to press him back into his seat. "Senator," she said again, her tone even softer now, as though speaking directly to him rather than to the entire chamber. "The American people deserve leaders who can listen as well as they speak. That's why I'm here. To listen, to speak truth, and to make sure every voice, not just the loudest voice in the room, is heard." This time the reaction was audible. A wave of gasps and murmurs spread across the gallery, blending with the clicking of camera shutters. For the first time all afternoon, it was Graham who looked small, dwarfed not by Crockett's volume, but by her restraint, by the clarity of words that echoed louder than any shout ever could. Graham fumbled. He shifted in his chair, muttering, under his breath. But each attempt to reclaim ground only deepened the contrast. His face flushed again, but now it read less like righteous anger and more like embarrassment. He tried to raise his voice, to cut across her words, but the chamber wasn't with him anymore. The air had shifted. The attention, the energy, the respect of the moment, all of it belonged to Crockett. She allowed a beat of silence to follow. Her words, a silence so sharp it felt intentional, surgical. It was the silence of a lawyer who knows that the jury has already been swayed, that nothing more needs to be said. Then, with the faintest of nods, she leaned back in her chair, yielding the microphone. And that was it. She didn't need to grandstand. She didn't need to deliver paragraph after paragraph. The line had already been delivered, the counterattack executed with surgical precision. Graham's unraveling was visible. His hands gripped the edge of the desk. His jaw clenched. He looked, not like a man who had won a battle, but like one who had been cornered by his own tactics. The chamber seemed to exhale collectively. For a moment it was as though history itself had paused to mark the line, to remember the instant the balance shifted. Reporters scribbled with urgency. their notes capturing what they knew would become the headline, the viral clip, the soundbite, replayed endlessly. Senators who had spent hours enduring Graham's shouting now looked at Crockett with something closer to awe. It was not the loudest who commanded the day. It was the calmest. Graham, rattled, tried once more to cut in, but his words stumbled, falling flat in the wake of Crockett's takedown. No matter how high he tried to raise his voice, the chamber heard only her calm. The contrast was undeniable, irreversible. His theatrics had met their match, and lost. And so the defining moment of the hearing was sealed, not with a roar, but with restraint. Crockett's mic drop line had dismantled the storm, reduced Graham's fury to background noise, and turned the chamber itself into a stage where dignity triumphed over bluster. The chamber wasn't just stunned. Within hours, millions more would be too. The hearing ended, but the moment did not. It leapt from the chamber to the world outside with the speed of a spark touching dry kindling. By the time senators were filing out, phones were already buzzing. Reporters had posted the clip within minutes, and social media seized it with both hands. The line, "Shouting is what you do when you've already lost the argument," was replayed endlessly, the caption emblazoned in bold text above looping videos. It trended within the hour. Hashtags sprouted and multiplied. Your calm crushes chaos. Your Crockett vs. Graham. Your mic drop moment. On Twitter, a storm of quote tweets mocked Graham's red-faced shouting. On TikTok, users synced Crockett's line with background beats, remixing it into anthems. On Instagram, Reels paired her calm stare with captions about standing strong in the face of bullies. And it wasn't just activists or political junkies. Everyday citizens, teachers, nurses, students, factory workers, posted their own reactions. Some wrote about shouting bosses or overbearing relatives, connecting Crockett's composure to their own daily battles. Others turned her into a symbol, the calm voice of truth in a noisy, chaotic world. By evening, celebrities weighed in. A-list actors tweeted out the clip with one-word captions like, "Queen." Musicians stitched her line into their Instagram stories. Talk show hosts scrambled to book her. The cultural echo chamber had found its star of the day, and her name was everywhere. Meanwhile, Graham found himself on the other side of the digital firestorm. Memes painted him as a cartoon character, face red, arms flailing, shouting into the void. Late-night comedians latched onto his meltdown, mocking the volume of his voice compared to the weakness of his argument. On podcasts, commentators replayed the clip and dissected his collapse, noting how Crockett's composure had exposed his shouting not as power but as panic. The contrast was unavoidable. On one side, dignity, calm, clarity. On the other, noise, bluster, defeat. And that contrast spread far beyond politics. Editorials in major newspapers framed the moment as a parable about leadership. Opinion writers called it the day calm, conquered chaos. Even business blogs referenced it as a lesson in negotiation and boardroom strategy. Don't be the Graham in the room. The ripple effects didn't stop at traditional media. On YouTube, commentary channels racked up millions of views breaking down the showdown. Reaction videos popped up by the hundreds with creators replaying the clip, pausing to cheer and declaring Crockett the future of political debate. Talk shows carried it further. That night, late-night comedy played the clip before roaring studio audiences. The host smirked, "This is why we keep C-SPAN bookmarked." The audience erupted with laughter as Graham's flailing contrasted against Crockett's stone-cold composure. The clip was now not just political news, it was pop culture. And yet, in the middle of the storm, Crockett herself seemed untouched by the frenzy. Reporters chased her down for quotes, but she resisted the urge to bask in the glow. For every headline celebrating her viral takedown, she calmly redirected the narrative. Her words, she insisted, were not about winning a personal spat. They were about something deeper, because Crockett knew what millions watching needed to hear next. That her composure wasn't just her own. It was rooted in history, in struggle, in the strength of communities that had too often been shouted down. The viral moment was already a victory, but Crockett was about to turn it into something bigger, something lasting. But Crockett herself would reframe it not as a personal victory, but as something much larger. In the days that followed, the noise of the viral moment might have tempted anyone else to claim victory, to bask in the spotlight. But Crockett refused to let the story remain just about her. When asked about Graham's outburst, she didn't gloat. She didn't sneer. She didn't even linger on her now famous line. Instead, she redirected the focus with the same quiet precision that had silenced the chamber. Her message was simple, but it cut deeper than any viral clip. Dignity will always outweigh arrogance. Calm will always outlast chaos. Shouting may dominate a room for a moment, but composure reshapes the conversation for years. She reminded her audience that what happened in that chamber wasn't just politics. It was life. Every worker who has endured a boss barking orders, every parent who has defended a child against an unfair system, every student who has been spoken over in class, they all knew the feeling of being shouted down. And they also knew the power of refusing to bend under that pressure. Crockett's reflection turned the confrontation into a parable. Bullies thrive on noise. They depend on fear, on the belief that volume equals victory. But history proves otherwise. From courtroom battles for civil rights to quiet protests that toppled empires, it has never been the loudest voices that truly changed the course of nations. It has been the steady ones, the ones anchored in truth, in patience, in moral clarity. For Crockett, her calm was not weakness but strength, the kind forged through years of representing the marginalized, the overlooked, the shouted down. Her training as a lawyer, her service as a public servant, her lived experience as a black woman in America, all of it had prepared her for this truth. When chaos rises, clarity can dismantle it without ever raising its volume. And in that lesson lay the broader theme. America's progress has always depended on voices like hers, not the ones who shout loudest, but the ones who endure longest, the ones who refuse to let arrogance define the narrative, who bring dignity into spaces designed to silence them. Her calm line was more than a viral moment. It was a reminder of what America could be. A place where integrity matters more than intimidation, where courage looks like keeping your composure while the world demands you lose it. For those watching, at home, the takeaway was clear. Integrity is not about never facing hostility. It is about how you carry yourself when hostility comes. Courage is not about shouting back. It is about holding steady when others unravel. And dignity is not just personal. It is collective, a strength that grows when one person's composure inspires countless others to find their own. Crockett closed her reflections with humility, but the effect was profound. She turned what some had called a mic drop into something far greater, a moral lesson for a divided nation. A reminder that in a world of rising tempers and collapsing norms, the true act of defiance is to remain grounded. And as she spoke, listeners felt it. The clash with Graham was no longer about two individuals. It was about a choice for everyone watching, to feed the chaos or to embody the calm, to mirror arrogance or to live with dignity, to surrender to the noise or to hold firm to the truth. The moment had passed. The chamber was silent again, but its meaning lingered. Crockett's calm line was no longer just hers. It belonged to everyone who needed it, and it left one final question lingering in the air. So when we look back at that day, Lindsey Graham red-faced and shouting, Jasmine Crockett calm and unflinching, it becomes clear that this wasn't just a clash between two politicians. It was a reflection of something much larger, the fight over what kind of America we want to live in. One path leads to arrogance, noise, and endless division. The other leads to dignity, composure, and the quiet strength that bends the arc of history. Because this wasn't just about Crockett versus Graham, it was about us, about how we choose to show up in the face of chaos. Do we let ourselves be pulled into the shouting, or do we hold steady, knowing that truth speaks loudest when spoken calmly? And that's why moments like this matter. They remind us that dignity is not passive. It is powerful. It is how ordinary people stand against extraordinary pressure. It is how we reclaim respect in a culture that too often rewards the loudest voice instead of the clearest one. If this story resonated with you, if you felt that same spark of inspiration watching Crockett dismantle the storm with a single calm line, then don't let it end here. Subscribe, share this story, and add your voice to a community that believes integrity still matters. Because when we spread these moments, we're not just replaying a debate. We're building a movement. And remember, history isn't written by those who shout the loudest. It's written by those who stand firm in the storm and remind us all what dignity looks like. Because in the end, dignity doesn't just win debates, it defines history.